August 17th, 1945. 4:23 p.m. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Heat pressed down like a physical weight, humid and thick, turning the air viscous. Keiko Tanaka stood in formation with 33 other Japanese women on asphalt that radiated stored heat through the thin soles of shoes that had disintegrated months ago. The sun was merciless, turning her dark blue civilian dress, worn since capture on Saipan 3 weeks earlier, into a furnace that trapped every degree. Sweat ran down her spine, pooling at the small of her back, but she didn't move to wipe it away. Movement drew attention. Attention meant selection. Selection meant the end she'd been preparing for since the moment American Marines had surrounded her hospital. She was 24 years old. She'd been a nurse at the military hospital on Saipan, tending wounded soldiers and civilians during the final chaotic weeks before the island fell. The propaganda had been explicit about what happened to Japanese women captured by Americans: violation, torture, death. The only honorable response was suicide. Keiko had tried. She'd swallowed the pills given to all medical staff, enough morphine to stop a heart, but her stomach had rejected them violently, and she'd woken hours later to American voices and the certainty that she'd failed in the most fundamental duty. She'd survived when she should have died. Now she would face whatever punishment that failure deserved. Beside her, Yuki Nakamura swayed slightly, threatening to collapse. Yuki was 19, had worked as a telephone operator, and spent the 3-week transport from Saipan convinced that each day was her last. She'd whispered prayers continuously, so quietly that guards couldn't hear, but her lips never stopped moving. The prayers had sustained her through the ship's hold, through processing in Hawaii, through the final transport to this camp in the middle of America, where heat felt different from Pacific heat, drier, heavier, inescapable. An American officer approached the formation. Major Robert Sullivan, 41, Keiko would learn later, with gray threading through brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that reflected sunlight. He carried no weapon visible, just a clipboard, and an expression of professional neutrality. He stopped 10 feet from the first row, and spoke in English that Keiko didn't understand. The words meant nothing, but the tone was significant. Matter-of-fact, administrative, devoid of rage or cruelty. That absence was more terrifying than violence would have been. Violence was comprehensible. This calm was not. An interpreter stepped forward. A Japanese-American woman in Women's Army Corps uniform, maybe 35, with features that matched Keiko's, but posture that was entirely American. She translated Sullivan's words into Japanese. "You will be processed through medical examination and housing assignment. You will receive clothing, bedding, and food. You will be assigned work appropriate to your capabilities. This is a prisoner of war facility operating under Geneva Convention protocols. You will be treated humanely. Do you understand?" Silence. Understanding and believing were different things. Keiko's mind struggled to process treated humanely as anything other than elaborate deception. The propaganda had prepared her for immediate execution or prolonged torture disguised as interrogation. It had not prepared her for administrative processing and promises of humane treatment. If this makes you question everything you thought you knew, you're paying attention. Subscribe now. These stories deserve to be heard. For the entirety of Keiko's life, Americans had existed in imperial propaganda as demons in human form. Not metaphorically, literally demons. The newsreels had been explicit. Americans were savage, subhuman creatures, motivated by bloodlust and racial hatred. They tortured prisoners for entertainment, violated women before executing them, desecrated bodies, committed atrocities that made death preferable to capture. These weren't subtle suggestions. They were state doctrine, reinforced through schools, radio broadcasts, newspapers, military briefings, until the narrative became cellular truth. The specific propaganda about treatment of captured women was even more explicit. Keiko had attended mandatory briefings in June 1945 as American forces closed in on Saipan. The officer conducting the session, Lieutenant Watanabe, whom she'd never seen again after the briefing, had been brutally direct. Capture by Americans means dishonor worse than death. They will use you, break you, display you as trophy before killing you. The only honorable response is to die before capture. If you cannot fight, if you cannot escape, you must end your own life. This is not cowardice. This is preserving the honor of the empire and your family. He'd distributed the morphine then. Small glass vials, enough to be lethal if kept down. Instructions were printed on rice paper that dissolved in water. Take all pills at once. Lie down. Wait for unconsciousness. Keiko had carried her vial in her uniform pocket for weeks, feeling the glass warm against her hip, a kind of insurance policy against the worst possibility. When American forces had overrun the hospital on July 9, 1945, Keiko had retreated to a supply closet with 5 other nurses. They'd taken their morphine together. Solemn ceremony. Each woman swallowing pills with water from a shared cup. Then they'd lain down to wait for death. Keiko remembered the bitter taste, the way her vision had blurred, the distant sound of American voices getting closer. She remembered thinking, "At least I die with honor intact." She'd woken 12 hours later in American medical custody, morphine purged from her system, alive when she absolutely should not be. The shame was immediate and overwhelming. She'd failed. Not just failed to die, but failed in the most basic requirement of Japanese womanhood under occupation, choosing death over dishonor. The other 5 nurses had succeeded. Their bodies had been carried out respectfully by American medics, who seemed confused by the suicides. Only Keiko had vomited up the pills and lived. The following 3 weeks were disorienting blur. Transport to the beach where American ships waited. Processing through makeshift facilities where she'd been photographed, fingerprinted, assigned a prisoner number, shipped to Hawaii. 2 weeks in a converted warehouse with 30 other surviving Japanese women. Mostly civilians, a few military like herself, all of whom should have died but hadn't. Then transport to the mainland, to this camp in Wisconsin where heat felt wrong, and the landscape was impossibly green and flat, in ways that made her dizzy. Now, standing on hot asphalt while Major Sullivan explained protocols, Keiko waited for the pretense to drop. Waited for the moment when administrative efficiency would give way to the brutality propaganda had promised. The Americans were patient. She'd give them that. 3 weeks of relatively decent treatment. Adequate food, no physical abuse, medical care for the sick. But eventually the mask would slip. Eventually, the demons would emerge. Major Sullivan gestured toward a long building at the compound's edge. The interpreter translated, "Medical examinations first. Female staff only. Follow Corporal Tanaka." Corporal Grace Tanaka, the Japanese-American interpreter, led them toward the medical building. She was from California, Keiko would learn later. Born in America to immigrant parents, loyal to the country that had nevertheless incarcerated her family in internment camps before recruiting her for her language skills. Her relationship to her heritage was complicated, visible in the way she translated military orders with perfect precision, but couldn't quite meet the prisoner's eyes. The medical building was cool, air-conditioned, the first genuinely comfortable temperature Keiko had experienced since capture. The coolness was disorienting. Luxury that didn't fit the narrative of American savagery. They were directed to a waiting room with chairs, actual furniture, and told to sit. Keiko sat gingerly, expecting the chair to be rigged somehow, to collapse or shock or reveal itself as part of the torture. It was just a chair. One by one, women were called for examination. When Keiko's number was called, she stood on legs that trembled and followed a nurse. White American woman, maybe 40, with kind eyes that Keiko didn't trust, into an examination room. The nurse gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." The words were in English, but the meaning was clear. Keiko sat. The nurse took her blood pressure, temperature, pulse, checked her eyes, ears, throat, asked questions through Corporal Tanaka about medical history, current symptoms, pain anywhere. The examination was thorough but gentle, hands that touched with professional care rather than violation. When it ended, the nurse smiled and said something that Tanaka translated. "You're malnourished and dehydrated, but generally healthy. We'll adjust your rations to help you gain weight." Any questions? Keiko had thousands of questions, none she could articulate. She shook her head. The nurse made notes on a chart, handed Keiko a small card with medical information, and dismissed her to the next station. The next station was clothing distribution. Long tables held stacks of dresses, simple cotton prints, civilian style rather than military, in various sizes. An older woman, clearly American civilian contracted for camp work, helped Keiko find her size. She held dresses up, checking length and fit, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. She selected a blue floral print, handed it to Keiko along with undergarments, socks, and flat shoes. "These are yours," Tanaka translated. "You can change in the room behind that curtain. Put your old clothes in the bag provided. They'll be cleaned or disposed of." Keiko changed behind the curtain, removing the dress she'd worn since capture. The fabric was stiff with sweat and salt, discolored beyond recovery. The new dress smelled of laundry soap and sunshine, clean beyond anything she'd experienced in months. It fit reasonably well, slightly loose in the shoulders, but comfortable. The shoes were worn, but functional. She emerged from behind the curtain feeling strange in her own skin. Dressed like civilian when she'd worn uniform, or filthy rags for so long she'd forgotten what normal clothing felt like. Housing assignment came last. Keiko and 5 other women, including Yuki, were assigned to Dormitory 4, Room 9. Corporal Tanaka led them across the compound to a wooden barracks, identical to dozens of others arranged in neat rows. The barracks was plain but clean, with windows that actually opened and screens to keep out insects. Room 9 had 3 bunk beds, a small table with chairs, and a coal stove in the corner. "You'll sleep here," Tanaka explained. "Lavatory is at the building's end. Running water, showers available on schedule. Dinner at 18:00 in the mess hall. Someone will knock to escort you. Any immediate needs." The 6 women stared at her in silence. Immediate needs felt impossible to name. They needed to understand what was happening, needed to reconcile 3 weeks of decent treatment with certainty of American brutality, needed to know when the pretense would end, but those weren't needs that could be stated. Tanaka nodded, understanding without explanation. "I know this is confusing. I know you expected something different. Just try to rest. Dinner in 2 hours." She left, closing the door but not locking it. The 6 women stood in their assigned room, looking at bunks and table and the door that wasn't secured. Yuki spoke first, voice barely audible. "When do they start?" "Start what?" Another woman, Michiko, 31, who'd been a postal clerk on Saipan, asked the question, but she knew the answer. The torture. Everything we were told would happen. Keiko had been wondering the same thing. 3 weeks of waiting for American savagery to manifest. 3 weeks of adequate food and medical care and administrative processing. 3 weeks that contradicted every narrative she'd absorbed about what capture meant. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. "Maybe this is the torture," she said quietly, "making us comfortable before." She didn't finish the sentence. Finishing would make it real. That evening, a knock came at 17:55. Not aggressive pounding. Just 3 polite raps. Yuki opened the door to find a young American soldier, maybe 22, with sandy hair and a smile that seemed genuine. He said something in English, gesturing toward the door. "Dinner," Corporal Tanaka translated from behind him. "Come with us, please." The mess hall was large, long tables with benches, organized chaos of maybe 200 people eating. The prisoners were directed to tables at one side, separated from American soldiers, but not dramatically, more organization than segregation. The food line was identical for everyone. Take a tray, move along the counter while kitchen staff added portions. Keiko took her tray and moved along the line. A heavy-set woman in kitchen whites ladled soup into a bowl. Vegetable beef, rich and steaming. Another added rice, then green beans, then a bread roll. A young man at the end offered butter for the roll. The portions were generous. More food than Keiko had seen on one plate in months. She carried her tray to the designated table, sat with the other Japanese women, and stared at the meal. "Is it poisoned?" Yuki whispered. Michiko picked up her spoon, examined the soup. They wouldn't poison hundreds of prisoners. Too inefficient. Just eat. Keiko tasted the soup. Hot, savory, with actual chunks of beef and carrots and potatoes. Her stomach cramped immediately, too rich after months of deprivation. but the taste was overwhelming. Real food. Substantial food. Not the watery rice gruel that had been standard during Saipan's final weeks. She ate slowly, each spoonful deliberate, aware that eating too quickly would cause vomiting. Halfway through the meal, something extraordinary happened. An American soldier, different one, older, maybe 30, approached their table carrying a wooden crate. He set it down and began distributing items. Glass bottles, 6 ounces each, filled with dark liquid. The distinctive shape was unmistakable even before Keiko could read the label. Coca-Cola. The soldier handed one to each woman. Smile friendly, saying something in English that included a word that sounded like, welcome. Then he moved to the next table, distributing more bottles. Keiko held the Coca-Cola bottle, feeling cold glass against her palm. The condensation was immediate. The bottle was refrigerated, impossibly cold in August heat. She'd seen Coca-Cola in photographs, propaganda images of American decadence and excess. The propaganda had used Coca-Cola as symbol of everything wrong with American culture. Frivolous, wasteful, designed to rot teeth and bodies. Japanese soldiers had been told that Americans fed Coca-Cola to prisoners as form of slow poisoning, that the sugar and chemicals were designed to weaken and sicken. She stared at the bottle. Through the dark glass, she could see bubbles rising. The cap was still sealed, metal crown with crimped edges. She turned it over, reading the English text embossed in the glass. Coca-Cola, trademark registered, 6FLOZ. They're mocking us, Yuki said. Her voice carried no emotion, just flat observation. Giving us their poisonous drink, making us consume the thing that represents everything we fought against. Keiko wasn't sure. The soldier who distributed them had seemed genuinely friendly, not mocking. The gesture felt like hospitality, except that made no sense. Americans didn't show hospitality to enemy prisoners. That contradicted everything. She watched other prisoners. Most were holding their bottles, examining them with similar confusion. A few had set them aside, refusing to touch them. But one woman, older, maybe 45, who'd been a teacher, had opened hers. The hiss of released carbonation was audible even across the table. The teacher lifted the bottle to her lips and drank. No immediate collapse. No convulsions. No evidence of poisoning. Just an older woman drinking Coca-Cola with an expression of surprised pleasure. Keiko opened her bottle. The cap came off with a pop and hiss, carbonation escaping in a small fog. The smell was distinctive. Sweet. Slightly medicinal. Unlike anything she'd encountered. She raised the bottle to her lips and tasted. Sweetness exploded on her tongue. Intense, almost overwhelming. Bubbles stinging slightly. The taste was complex. Vanilla, maybe, and something like cinnamon, and underlying bitterness balanced by sugar. It was cold, refreshingly cold, washing away the heaviness of the soup. She took another sip, then another, feeling carbonation tingle down her throat. It wasn't poisonous. Or if it was, the poison worked slowly enough to be indistinguishable from refreshment. Keiko drank half the bottle before setting it down, carbonation making her feel slightly bloated but undeniably satisfied. She looked at the bottle. Still half full, dark liquid and rising bubbles. Label slightly damp from condensation. The bottle was just a bottle, but it represented something she couldn't quite name. Hospitality from enemies, kindness from demons, reality contradicting propaganda so thoroughly that her understanding of the world required complete reconstruction. This wasn't sentiment. This was policy, though Keiko wouldn't understand the framework for weeks. The American approach to prisoner management in the Pacific Theater was complicated by racial dynamics that didn't exist in the European theater. Japanese propaganda had been so effective at painting Americans as subhuman that captured Japanese soldiers and civilians often attempted suicide rather than surrender. This created operational problems. Dead prisoners provided no intelligence. Mass suicides created sanitation and morale issues. And the spectacle of enemy civilians killing themselves contradicted American narratives about liberation. The solution was systematic demonstration that American treatment contradicted Japanese propaganda. Feed prisoners well, not just adequately, but generously. Provide medical care immediately and thoroughly. Distribute small luxuries, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, candy, that demonstrated America's industrial capacity and willingness to share abundance. The policy rested on 4 calculations. First, intelligence value. Well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate with interrogators. Second, psychological warfare. Prisoners who received decent treatment might spread word that surrender wasn't death sentence, potentially reducing Japanese resistance. Third, demonstrating moral superiority. Treating enemy prisoners well contrasted American values with Japanese brutality toward Allied POWs. Fourth, domestic propaganda. Photographs of well-treated Japanese prisoners could be used to show American public that their nation maintained civilization even in brutal Pacific War. The Coca-Cola distribution was explicit part of this strategy. Internal Army memos stated, "Small luxuries have disproportionate psychological impact." Coca-Cola is distinctly American product, symbol of home front prosperity. Sharing it with prisoners demonstrates generosity, abundance, willingness to treat enemies as human beings, deserving small pleasures. Cost is minimal. Psychological benefit substantial. Over the following days, Keiko learned the camp's structure through repetition. Wake at 0630 to a bell, not violent awakening. Morning roll call at 07 in the yard, standing in lines while names were checked against rosters, no abuse or harassment. Breakfast at 0730, oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast with butter, coffee or tea. The abundance was staggering after months of scarcity on Saipan. Work assignments began at 09:00. Keiko was assigned to the camp hospital. Her nursing training was valuable, and American staff needed help with increasing prisoner population. She worked under supervision of Lieutenant Janet Morrison, 32, Army Nurse Corps, efficient and professional. Morrison spoke no Japanese, but demonstrated procedures clearly, and checked Keiko's work with thoroughness that was quality control rather than mistrust. The hospital work was familiar enough to be comforting, changing bandages, taking vitals, assisting with examinations. The supplies were abundant, clean bandages readily available, medications in quantities Keiko had never seen, equipment that functioned properly. On Saipan, the hospital had run out of morphine in May, out of bandages in June, had resorted to boiling and reusing surgical instruments because supplies couldn't get through American blockade. Here, supplies seemed infinite. During a break on her 3rd day, Lieutenant Morrison handed Keiko something unexpected, a small paper cup filled with white substance that Keiko didn't recognize. Morrison made eating gestures, smiling. "Ice cream," she said in English. "Vanilla." Keiko stared at the cup. Ice cream. She knew what it was intellectually. Frozen cream and sugar, American luxury product, something she'd never actually tasted. On Saipan, ice had been impossible luxury. Fresh food was scarce. The idea of freezing cream for pleasure rather than preservation seemed impossibly decadent. She tasted it tentatively. The cold was shocking. It hurt her teeth, but the sweetness and creaminess were extraordinary. The texture was unlike anything she'd experienced, smooth and rich and melting on her tongue. She took another small bite, letting it melt completely before swallowing. The ice cream was better than anything propaganda had prepared her for. Not evidence of decadence exactly, but evidence of abundance so complete that freezing cream for pleasure was routine rather than remarkable. Morrison watched her reaction, smiling at Keiko's obvious surprise. She said something in English that included what sounded like approval, then returned to work. The ice cream was gone in perhaps 20 small bites, each one savored completely. When the cup was empty, Keiko held it for a moment, examining the waxed paper, the way small amounts of melted cream pooled at the bottom. This was enemy territory. She was prisoner, but she'd just eaten ice cream during work break, shared by supervisor who seemed to genuinely enjoy her surprise. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. In September, Keiko received her first letter from home. The envelope was thin, travel-worn, addressed in her father's handwriting. She opened it with trembling hands, aware that others were watching. Receiving mail meant family knew she was alive, which meant they knew she'd survived capture, which meant they knew she'd failed to die honorably. The letter was brief, carefully worded to pass censors on both sides. Keiko, We are grateful beyond words that you are alive. We had received notification of your death on Saipan. Learning you survived and are prisoner in America is complicated joy. Joy that you live, complicated by circumstances. Your mother sends love. Your brother is well. Tokyo suffers, but we endure. Do not despair. Come home when circumstances allow. You are still our daughter, regardless. Father, Keiko read. You are still our daughter, regardless. 5 times. The word, regardless, carried weight. Regardless of capture, regardless of survival, regardless of dishonor. Her father was telling her that family bonds superseded propaganda narratives about honorable death, that living was preferable to dying. Even if living meant shame. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her pocket, and felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking exactly, but shifting. Maybe survival wasn't complete failure. Maybe the propaganda had been wrong about more than American treatment of prisoners. Maybe honor wasn't as simple as choosing death. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war, and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. By October, small changes accumulated into transformation. The twice-weekly Coca-Cola distribution had become routine. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, crates arrived at the mess hall. Soldiers distributed bottles. Prisoners drank them without suspicion. Keiko had developed a technique of making hers last. Small sips over 20 minutes, savoring the sweetness and cold, the way carbonation tickled her throat. The Coca-Cola bottle, particularly the one from her first evening, had become symbol she couldn't quite articulate. She'd kept that first bottle, rinsed it clean, and placed it on the windowsill in room 9. The other women had added their bottles, until 6 empty Coca-Cola bottles stood in a row, glass catching afternoon light, creating small rainbows on the wall opposite. They'd become inadvertent decoration, evidence of routine that contradicted propaganda. Lieutenant Morrison continued surprising Keiko with small luxuries. Ice cream appeared weekly during breaks, sometimes vanilla, sometimes chocolate, once strawberry that was pink and tasted like summer. Morrison also began teaching Keiko English during slow periods, pointing to objects and pronouncing names, writing words on paper for Keiko to practice. The lessons were practical, medical terminology primarily, but they expanded beyond that. Bandage, thermometer, stethoscope, ice cream, friend. The last word made Keiko pause. Friend? She repeated it carefully, testing pronunciation. Morrison nodded, smiled, pointed to herself and then to Keiko. Friend, she repeated with emphasis. Keiko understood the word's meaning, but struggled with its application. Could enemy and prisoner be friends? Could people who should hate each other instead share ice cream and language lessons? The propaganda had never addressed this possibility, because the propaganda assumed Americans wouldn't be decent humans, and that decent humans couldn't be enemies. In November, Thanksgiving arrived with surprising ceremony. Major Sullivan announced that prisoners would participate in the traditional American feast. This is American holiday, Corporal Tanaka translated, celebrating gratitude and abundance. You will eat the same meal as staff, turkey, potatoes, vegetables, pie. This is not reward or privilege. This is simply how we observe Thanksgiving. The feast was overwhelming. Keiko had never seen so much food on one table. Whole roasted turkey, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans with almonds, cranberry sauce, rolls with butter, and pie with whipped cream. The portions were enormous. She ate slowly, methodically, aware that her stomach couldn't handle the richness, but unwilling to waste food that represented such abundance. During the meal, a young soldier, Private Tommy Chen, 21, Chinese-American from San Francisco, approached the prisoner's table carrying a crate. Inside were more Coca-Cola bottles, but also something else. He distributed the Coca-Colas first, then handed out small rectangular objects wrapped in silver foil. Keiko unwrapped hers carefully. Inside was chocolate. Hershey's, the label announced. She'd seen chocolate in photographs but never tasted it. She broke off a small square and placed it on her tongue. The sweetness was intense but different from sugar. Richer, more complex, with slight bitterness underneath. The chocolate melted, coating her mouth, and she understood why Americans love this. Private Chen said something in English that Tanaka translated, "Happy Thanksgiving. Even in war, we can share good things." Keiko looked at him. Young man, enemy soldier, giving her chocolate with genuine smile, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding. Americans were supposed to be demons. Demons didn't give chocolate. Demons didn't celebrate gratitude and abundance. Demons didn't treat prisoners to feasts and small luxuries. Either the propaganda was comprehensive lie, or Americans were extraordinarily good at deception. The former seemed more likely. December brought an incident that revealed the system's actual limits. A guard, Sergeant Donald Burke, 36, transfer from another facility, made inappropriate comment during evening inspection. Keiko didn't understand the English words, but the tone and accompanying gesture were unmistakable. Yuki, whose English had improved enough to catch the meaning, went pale. Before any prisoner could respond, Major Sullivan appeared. "Sergeant Burke, my office, now." Burke tried to protest. Sullivan cut him off. That wasn't a request. The inspection continued without Burke. Keiko never saw him again. The next day, Private Chen explained through Tanaka. Burke was transferred. Disciplinary action filed. Major Sullivan doesn't tolerate disrespect toward prisoners. You're enemy combatants, not objects. Standards apply to everyone. The message was consistent with British camps Keiko had heard about through camp gossip. Inappropriate behavior toward prisoners wasn't accepted. Guards who couldn't maintain professional standards were removed. Civilization wasn't automatic. It required enforcement. That night, Keiko lay in her bunk, unable to sleep. She retrieved the Coca-Cola bottle from the windowsill, the first one, now companion and symbol. She held it in her hands, feeling smooth glass, examining the embossed text. This bottle was just glass and air and residual smell of vanilla cinnamon sweetness, but it represented something larger. The moment her certainty about American brutality had cracked. The moment small luxury had forced her to question everything she'd been taught. If Americans were demons, they were demons who gave Coca-Cola and ice cream. If capture meant dishonor, it was dishonor accompanied by turkey dinners and language lessons. If propaganda was true, then truth was more complicated than propaganda allowed. Questions accumulated in her mind. If the narrative about American savagery was false, and it was demonstrably, thoroughly false, what else had been lies? The claim that Japan fought defensive war? The narrative about racial superiority? The doctrine that certain peoples were subhuman and could be enslaved or eliminated? If American prisoners were treated with the brutality that Japanese propaganda attributed to Americans, then maybe Japan's moral framework was built on projections, accusing enemies of the very crimes Japan committed. Keiko didn't have answers. The questions alone were destabilizing, dangerous, liberating. They required rebuilding her understanding of the world from foundations that had cracked beyond repair. The Coca-Cola bottle in her hands, empty but preserved, utilitarian but meaningful, became symbol of that reconstruction. In January 1946, Lieutenant Morrison announced that Keiko would receive additional responsibilities. "Your work is excellent," Tanaka translated. "You'll train new prisoners arriving next week. Teach them hospital procedures. You'll also receive small payment. Camp script that can be used at the canteen. This is fair compensation for skilled work. Payment for work. Prisoners of war receiving wages." The concept was disorienting. Keiko had expected forced labor, exploitation, work without compensation or respect. Instead, she was being promoted and paid, trusted to train others, treated as skilled professional rather than slave. The canteen was a small facility where prisoners could purchase items with scrip. Toiletries, candy, magazines, small luxuries. Keiko's first visit was overwhelming. Shelves stocked with products, abundance that seemed impossible. She purchased a bar of scented soap, a comb, and, almost without thinking, a 6-pack of Coca-Cola. She could buy her own now, not distributed by Americans, but purchased with money she'd earned. The autonomy was strange and powerful. February brought news of repatriation planning. Major Sullivan announced, "The war is over. Repatriation schedules are being arranged for spring and summer. You'll return to Japan in groups, processed through occupation authorities. Begin preparing for transition back to civilian life." Keiko had many questions, but none she could articulate. Return to Japan meant facing destroyed Tokyo, family that knew she'd survived capture, society that valued honorable death over shameful survival. But it also meant family, home, language she understood without translation, culture she knew. The choice was complicated by the fact that it wasn't really choice. She would return because staying was impossible, but the months at Fort McCoy had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She'd learned that enemies could be decent, that propaganda was lies stacked on lies, that small luxuries, Coca-Cola and ice cream and chocolate, could communicate humanity more effectively than speeches about morality. In April, Yuki asked the question aloud, "What will you tell your family? About here?" Keiko held one of the Coca-Cola bottles, turning it slowly in her hands. "I'll tell them I survived, that the Americans treated us fairly, that everything we were told was wrong. Will they believe you? I don't know. But I have to try." On her last evening at Fort McCoy, May 12, 1946, Lieutenant Morrison found Keiko in the hospital during final inventory. She handed Keiko a small package wrapped in brown paper. For the journey. For remembering. Inside was an unopened bottle of Coca-Cola, a bar of Hershey's chocolate, and a handwritten note in English. Corporal Tanaka translated, "You were excellent nurse and good person. War made us enemies, but humanity made us colleagues. Remember that enemies can be decent. Build peace, where war left ruins. Lieutenant J. Morrison." Keiko tried to thank her, struggling with English that remained imperfect despite months of lessons. Morrison waved off the gratitude, then did something unexpected. She embraced Keiko. Brief hug, professional but genuine. The physical contact of people who'd worked together and developed respect despite everything. The journey back to Japan took 19 days. Train to California, ship across the Pacific, arrival at Yokohama under American occupation. Keiko carried a small bag with her few possessions. Letters from family, the dress she'd received at Fort McCoy, and the Coca-Cola bottle and chocolate from Morrison, wrapped carefully to prevent breaking. Tokyo was worse than letters had described. Entire districts burned to ash, rubble stretching to horizons, people living in makeshift shelters. Her family's neighborhood was partially destroyed, their house damaged but habitable. Her father looked older, thinner, but wept when he saw her. Her mother held her without speaking, fingers digging into Keiko's shoulders with strength that seemed impossible from such frail arms. "You came home," her father said finally. "You survived and came home. That's what matters." Decades later, in a modest Tokyo apartment in a rebuilt city, Keiko Tanaka, married now, mother of 3, grandmother of 7, kept an empty Coca-Cola bottle on a shelf in her kitchen. Not the original bottles from Fort McCoy, which had broken during the return journey, but an identical bottle, purchased decades later, kept as reminder and testimony. Her granddaughter, 15, and studying World War II in school, asked about it one evening while helping prepare dinner. "Oba-chan, why do you keep an empty bottle? That's so strange." Keiko was preparing tea. Habit from before the war she'd never abandoned. She set down the pot and picked up the Coca-Cola bottle, feeling smooth glass, remembering the first time American soldier had handed her one and her certainty that it was poison. "This is from America, from when I was prisoner. An American nurse gave it to me." The girl looked confused, her understanding shaped by textbooks that painted clear distinctions between victims and perpetrators. "But weren't the Americans our enemies?" "Yes," Keiko said. "They were. Then why did she give you Coca-Cola?" Keiko returned the bottle to its shelf, positioned precisely where morning light would catch the glass. "Because people are more complicated than nations. Because even enemies can choose to be decent to each other. Because she wanted me to remember that humanity survives even in war, and small gestures, Coca-Cola and ice cream and chocolate, can communicate that humanity more powerfully than weapons or words. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and why. The bottle remained on the shelf, empty but meaningful. Testimony to the long journey from certainty to confusion to understanding. Keiko drank Coca-Cola regularly even in her 80s, developed taste for it during captivity that never faded. And each time she opened a bottle, the hiss of carbonation brought her back to August 1945, to heat and confusion, and the moment an American soldier had offered her sweetness when she'd expected only cruelty. The war had taught millions of Japanese that Americans were demons, that capture meant torture and death, that honor required choosing suicide over survival. But in a camp in Wisconsin, a different lesson was taught through small acts repeated daily until they became testimony. Enemies can be decent when they choose to be. Survival isn't shame when it creates opportunity to rebuild. And sometimes the measure of civilization is as simple as sharing Coca-Cola with people you're supposed to hate, offering ice cream to prisoners who expected only punishment, demonstrating through small luxuries that abundance can be generous rather than hoarded, that humanity persists even across battle lines. The empty bottle sat in morning light, glass catching sun, creating small rainbows on the opposite wall. Testament to the truth that propaganda is always less powerful than lived experience, that small kindnesses accumulate into transformation, that the ability to question everything you've been taught is the first step toward building something better than what war destroyed. The measure of a nation isn't found in its weapons or victories. It's found in how it treats the people it has every reason to hate, but chooses to humanize instead. It's found in Coca-Cola bottles handed to prisoners who expected execution, in ice cream shared during work breaks, in chocolate given freely during holidays. Sometimes civilization is just that simple, choosing to share sweetness when bitterness would be easier, offering cold refreshment when cruelty would be expected, demonstrating that even in war, especially in war, humanity means something beyond propaganda and hate.